That's when I started with James right there. And it's funny because when I went to work for James, I was living in a little trailer beside the shop right there. And actually, one time me and Kurt Shelmerdine were living in this little trailer beside the shop. It's probably about an 18, 20-foot trailer with one living on one end and one living on the other. So, that's an experience working for James.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, what kind of a boss was he?
He was a great boss.
I thought that.
But it just, it was a never-ending job with James. I mean, he built all the motors, and myself and all the volunteer guys around town kept the car up. But James didn't know anything about quitting time. I mean, you had to be at work at 8 o'clock the next morning, but you might be out there till 12, 1, 2 o'clock in the morning, is whatever it took. You just had to get the car ready. You know, and sometimes you only had a couple of days to turn, because back then you only had 1 or 2 cars. So you're lucky if you had 2 cars. So we would wreck a car. We wrecked a car at Talladega and drove straight from there to Banjo Shop. Had to put a front clip on. It's when he T-boned Marty Robbins. The only race we didn't finish that year. We finished 3rd in the points. And that's the only race we didn't finish, is when he T-boned Marty right there. I think Marty wrecked or spun or something and came down, and James T-boned him right there. And the Talladega car, we had to run it the next weekend in Bristol, which is nowadays unheard of. You know, you're not going to run your Bristol car and your Talladega car. They're long ways apart. They're a little different from each other. And we went there and worked around the clock for 2 or 3 days. I mean, we'd be working in Banjo Shop, and all his guys, everybody's sitting there working, and you'd be in there working, and you needed a part of the truck, and you'd grab the flashlight and walk outside, and the sun's up. It's the middle of the day. You know, you just lose track of days, because we worked at least 2 days straight. But we made it the next weekend. We were at Bristol with that same, I mean, it was Nashville. No. We were there with that same car.
Yeah, that kind of workload might make a fella think about moving on.
Well, it did when you're young and dumb. It and you know, you and I guess I got to say I never was a real big race fan, but I loved working on them, and I loved the people and stuff. So I enjoyed working on them. So good thing, or I'd have probably quit.
Did you now help the chronology here? Did you shift over to Richard Childress after James? Or not?
Yeah, I came and worked for Richard in '77. I worked for Richard, and I left the middle of the season. Ricky and them were running for Rookie of the Year, and they needed some help, so I quit about halfway through the season. Right there in June, I think it was, when Richard came back from Riverside. He had gone out to race out there, and I quit I left when he came back, and went back to work for Ricky and them to help them get through the Rookie of the Year deal.
Now, we know what Richard Childress Racing eventually became.
Yeah.
1977, when you went to work there, what was Richard Childress Racing like at that point?
Oh, it was a little shop on Walltown Street. And just a bunch of volunteer guys, you know, just a small shop. We had a box truck and a open trailer behind us, like most of the guys did back then. Cecil Gordon there, that's what everybody had, was a box truck back then and an open trailer back there. But you know, he's mostly volunteer help. I mean, he had his own motor room, so he was ahead of a lot of the guys. He had actually mechanics that built the motors for him and stuff, instead of like James built his own. But then there was a lot of guys around town that volunteered, and actually Patterson. Patterson works for him now, still works for him, and he was volunteer help, would come in the shop, help at night, and there was a local policeman around there, and I can't remember these guys' names for anything. But he would come in, he'd be on duty, and he'd drive by the shop, and he'd come in there, and we might need a hand cutting a piece of rod or something for a window net or something like that, and he's over in there with his guns and his uniform on, and he's over at the vice cutting metal. You know, just anybody come by, you just jump in and help, you know, whatever it took to get the job done.
Wow. I did not become involved in the sport until the late 80s. The impression that I always got of the NASCAR in the mid-70s, early 80s, was it was almost like the Wild Wild West. It was kind of everybody did their thing, and they were having a good time on the road, and it was I don't want to say a free-for-all, but it was a good time.
It was a great time. I mean, it was actually wilder before then. When I came into it, it was actually toning down some, you know, because it was starting to get known, and you couldn't do the things you used to do. I mean, I heard all the stories. You know, everybody's heard all the stories with Curtis Turner and all those guys back in the day and stuff. And I know my cousin Bill, they were staying at the Thunderbird Motel there in Darlington. And a couple of drivers went over and knocked on his door and talked him into, they drug him down the motel somewhere. And while he was down, a couple more went in there, and they had one of those sprinklers out in the yard that goes back and forth that waters your yard. They stuck it in his room. It was out there where they were watering the lawn. They stuck it in his room. And he came back, and I mean, the bed was soaking wet. All his clothes were soaking wet. Everything in the whole room, walls, ceiling, everything was soaking wet in that room. But they were all a bunch of jokesters. But everybody did back then. And like I said, it was wilder, like I said, before that, because they would, I mean, you'd hear where G.C. Spencer, he always had a pistol stuck under the seat of the race car, even when he's on there, because those guys used to have bill collectors, or used to have people come to them. You know, they knew they was at the racetrack, and they'd confront them right there. Yeah. Well, they kept a gun in the car with them. 2 or 3 of them did that. So the days before that were really the Wild West, and it still was a sort of a free-for-all when we were there. I really enjoyed the part of it because, I mean, at 21, 22 years old, you know, when Ricky and them started, I mean, who would have thought that some kids that young, and Ricky was 3 years younger. Ricky's brother and I, AJ, were the same age. And Ricky was 3 years younger than us. And he just give us cash and a credit card or whatever and a truck and trailer, and we'd go to California. We'd go all over the country like that, couple 20-year-old kids. You know, and now that I'm married and have them kids that were in their 20s, I don't hardly trust them to go to 7-Eleven, you know. I can imagine going across country with it like that. Just here you go.
Wow.
Well, in '78, you were still a back to Childress, I think, or because you were listed as a screw chief, right?
Yeah.
Is that how you got
Well,
you back?
it could have been. Let's see. It could have been '78. I tell you, I have a hard time remembering the years right there, because I went back to Hilton at one time.
Yeah.
And then I went to Richard, but. I don't say how, because in '77 he won the Rookie of the Year.
Yeah.
And it could have been right along there.
Yeah, you're listed as the screw chief in '78.
'78, okay. I know '79 I went to work for Grant Adcox.
Yes.
And ran that season with him.
Yeah. Now, in '78 with Richard, did he lure you back by saying you'll be my crew chief, or
No, I mean,
you just went? Yeah.
Tim Brewer had just left.
Ah.
And he needed somebody to fill that slot, so he hired me to do that.
Now I know that Richard Childress and James Hilton, they were pretty tight.
Yeah.
As fellow independents. Was it almost a deal where Richard needed some help, so you went and helped him, and then James needed some help, and you went?
No, I was in between. I guess I had left. Ricky and them, where, you know, money got tight or whatever, things happened, and you left and went, you know, because they weren't going to, you know, run some or something like that, and I needed a job, so I went over and I'd go back to James or something. And the second time I went back to James is when Kurt Shelmerdine was there, and he and I shared that little trailer.
Yeah. Okay.
But at one time, the first time, I think I lived in James's house right there. Because Evelyn used to, she'd cook me breakfast and stuff like that, and her hanging out was a real plus. Actually have home cooked meals.
Now I have always heard that RC and James had a bit of a relationship where they would kind of pick at each other a little bit.
All the time.
All the time.
What's your best James Hilton RC picking on each other's story?
Well,
I know one, but I can't tell it.
Exactly. I'm trying to think.
We talked about it on the podcast.
Really, the only best one that I know, I can't tell. You know, the short of it, we had both headed to California.
That's the one.
We were going to California and had both gone the middle route, going across 40. And everybody had left at separate times, and it kind of passed through the same towns. And, didn't even know where the other person was. And we had stopped in El Paso and got a burger or something. And when we came out on the ramp, here he came right up beside us. I mean, you couldn't have timed it if you'd have tried. Pull right up beside us coming off the ramp right there in El Paso. But those two were something else. You know, they used to lock each other in the back of the trailer when they had the driver's meeting. You know, back then you didn't get fined for missing the driver's meeting and stuff. You just missed the driver's meeting, and that's why they had to start fining them stuff, making them show up. But they would catch them in there changing clothes or doing something, and they'd padlock the back door, lock them in the trailer, something like that. You know.